Let's talk about Mad Max: The Road Warrior. Now, what's so strange about the Mad Max series, having now seen 3 of the 4 Mad Max films, I've seen Mad Max, the original one, Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, and I've also seen Mad Max Fury Road. But there's no real connection between them. In fact, the newest one doesn't even have Mel Gibson in it, which was kind of the only thing that kept this mythic character connected throughout the whole thing, and this one doesn't even have that, which is a really unique way to make a series of films, and it shows that George Miller really isn't concerned so much with the character of Mad Max or the story of Mad Max as much as he is concerned with world building. And if I had just seen the first Mad Max and went into this one, I would be very much confused because the first Mad Max movie is just about a guy against a biker gang. It takes place in what is then modern times, like the mid early 80s. And basically, a biker gang kills his wife and son or daughter, and he just basically goes on this revenge killing. And that's the whole film. And then you get to this one, and you're in this post-apocalyptic world. And what's so strange is there's no real reason for it. I mean, of course, there's this wonderful montage at the beginning that's really cool and I absolutely love, and it's almost Eisenstein-esque in the montage where it tells the story of how mankind has kind of destroyed itself due to capitalism and materialism and its obsession with fuel and oil and gasoline and these different things, and it's really fun. And I wonder why George Miller was like, we need to create a post-apocalyptic world, because before this film it was just a guy on a bike, and it seems like George Miller just kind of wanted to make these really strange characters, and that's exactly what he did. And this film is just full of these really weird and unique and strange characters. There's of course the guy with the flying machine. None of these people really have names, so it will be a little bit challenging to talk about this film. But there's the man who I think is just absolutely insane, who has the flying machine. There's of course Mad Max. There is the bad guys who seem, I mean, there seem to be certainly I don't want to say an homage to, but a lot of bondage and kink-like fetishes it kind of is inspired by, and just their outfits are just absolutely absurd, and they really don't, the outfits don't really make any, like, logically they don't make sense why anyone would wear them, because they're not exactly protective. I mean, some of them of course are, like you see the people with kind of like the basically what a football player would wear, which I think is interesting when you kind of get to post-apocalyptic times. You're like, yeah, that's probably what most people are wearing is kind of old football uniforms or the like, just to stay protected from this incredibly cruel and dangerous world. But then, of course, there are other people wearing like the jock straps basically, or chains around their neck, and there's this real I will say, for a film made in the 80s, there is a real openness and acceptance to homosexuality, and I wonder if you could almost look through this film through the lens of homosocietal kind of a academic lens. And I think there'd be really a lot to say about this film in that realm. It never at any point condemns homosexuality or sees homosexuality or the love of homosexuality as anything other than modern or any other kind of love. I mean, this is by far ahead of its time. Think of, films that came out in a similar period and how they deal with homosexuality. Even so many films today where they're so hyper masculine, that they do not paint a good light on homosexuality. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about this film is, even though it's this super violent and hyper masculine film, it still kind of delves into this one of the main relationships between, I don't know, the bad guy and his partner is one of homosexuality, and the whole gang seems to have a relationship like that, and it seems to be a relationship that kind of goes far and wide within these communities. And even though there's all this killing and sex and boobs, and like there's just these points where like nudity will be shown for no reason other than just for the masculinity of it and the manliness of it. Homosexuality in the same way is shaped as this very masculine and manly thing, and I think it's a really empowering way to show something. Obviously today that really wouldn't be that, you know, big of a deal, but especially back in the 80s when it came out, I think that's a big step forward, and honestly a risk for George Miller to make. I mean, I'm sure if the film wasn't so extraordinarily masculine, I think there would be a lot more criticism against this film. Not necessary criticism, but just, criticism from a uniquely heterosexual community that is uncomfortable with their own uh, sexuality. And this film doesn't even make a deal, right? It's not even like, oh, look at this, it's a homosexual relationship. I mean, you think of even modern films that have homosexual relationships, and that's like the button, right? There are so many modern films where the the conflict is that they're gay. Like that's the whole conflict. And that's just kind of a lame conflict. And this film is like, no, just love is love. Men love men, women love women, men love women, women love men. There's no kind of in between, and it doesn't try to minimize any relationship, and it gives a real motive to uh I suppose not like the leader of the bad guys, but perhaps in many ways the antagonist that's most interesting character, because he has a very real motive, which is that his partner is killed 30 to 45 minutes into this film. And then, of course, other than Max and his, well, honestly, captive, the guy who has the flying machine, out helicopter like machine, which, I mean, talking about stunts, and there are so many stunts in this film to talk about. It seems to me that they would have to build that machine because there are way too many shots where, I mean, either they have special effects beyond anything I can understand, and possibly they do, but it really feels like they actually built this machine. And if they didn't, I mean, even bigger not, but it kind of feels like they actually built this machine, which is absolutely amazing that they built this strange machine, because there are so many shots that I'm like, if he isn't flying, I'm not really sure how that shot would work. And of course, for most of the shots where he's flying, he's not actually flying. They're just pointing the camera upward and having the propeller spin. But there's a couple of shots where I swear I think he's flying. And just, it's amazing that a film from the 80s can trick me in a way that so many modern films would be like, oh yeah, that's CGI. Which just another nod to the incredible George Miller. And I mean the stunts as a whole. Obviously, so many of these stunts are practical effects, and then they're not even effects, they're things they actually do. The jumping from car to car, the the crashes and the explosions. It's absolutely incredible. And then when we're talking about the three groups of people, the third group, of course, is the, I don't know, the society. I'm not really sure how to refer to these people. They're the people that own the gasoline. And one of the characters is of course the child. And the child's, honestly, at the beginning of the film, I was pretty irritated by him because he's kind of stupid, and I was like, this is dumb. But as the film went on, I grew to really like the child, which I was kind of surprised by, especially because George Miller being George Miller, every character has this really kind of unique way in the world, and there's very weird and unique look, and the way people dress is always interesting, but also how like they do their hair. Like I don't know why there's that one woman whose hair is like straight up. Not really sure why. Not really sure why she can't just do a regular ponytail, but certainly so many interesting stories to explore here. And of course, there's the child who can't speak for some reason, and it at no point is it clear whose child this is, and no one seems to treat him like their child or like a maternal or paternal figure. And perhaps that's to speak more to the fact that in this sort of post-apocalyptic world, there's no time for fatherhood, for motherhood. There is no parents. Every person's for themselves, including children. And this child doesn't. I mean, they're probably, I don't know, 7, 8 years old, maybe 5, 6. It's kind of hard to say. And this child doesn't like have any sort of speech patterns. He can like growl and bark and bite, but he communicates non-verbally, but not like with sign language or anything like that. And he's going off killing people. I mean, he kills as many people as anyone else with his weird boomerang thing. And that just brings me to something that the first film was missing, that this film has a lot of, and I'm not sure how noticeable at the time it is, but certainly looking back on it today in the 21st century, I can certainly see is just how funny the film is. I mean, there are just so many humorous moments, and I think something George Miller does really well is he's walking this really thin line, which on one hand, yes, it's a post-apocalyptic film. There are very sad and dangerous things about it, but the thing about making a film like that is it's inherently ridiculous. I mean, just the whole idea of people wearing, these kind of kinky outfits and driving these insane vehicles and murdering each other for gasoline is inherently ridiculous. And for so many films of the 80s and of that era, they would just play into that and not recognize their own absurdities. And what I argue this film does so well is George Miller is able to recognize that this is absurd, and there are so many moments that are just really funny, especially like when the bad guy's like having the conversation over the mic to the like community and you can like kind of see like the struggle between him and the other people in the bad guy community kind of argue with each other and bicker, and you are reminded that even in a post-apocalyptic world, even in a world of terror and horror, humans are still humans and still ridiculous. And there's a scene where one of them tries to catch the boomerang and just cuts his hand right off, and it's surprisingly, for a film as violent as it is not a very gory film. It is not gory like so many of the horror films and slasher films of the time. There's actually very little blood in the film, even though there's so much violence, which I think is interesting and was perhaps a way to kind of get around certain ratings at the time, because the way they rated things was very different than how they rate today. But I really admire how George Miller was able to make this film humorous, but still have stakes. I think it's very easy, and then this is such a thin line where a humorous film loses its stakes. And there's nothing wrong with having a film that is merely humorous, and there are plenty of films that that like lack traditional stakes and are still enjoyable films. They are just a very different experience. They're not the traditional experience of kind of being on the edge of your seat. And if this film didn't have stakes, that really wouldn't work. So much of this film depends upon stakes, because if you actually look, I would say if you looked at the script, which I haven't yet, there's probably only maybe 30 pages of dialogue. I mean, so much of it's a very quiet film, which is certainly a nod to George Miller as a director and the writer, which I know George Miller was one of, but there are two other writers. It's really a nod to all the people on this film to make really a whole film that has such little dialogue, which is always very challenging, especially in, I suppose, what we would call the modern era. But the problem also is, well, I think it is a big leap of faith, and at times it really works. That's also, I would say, where the film fails. When there was about 30 minutes left of this film, and it's a short film, it's only an hour and a half long. So we're an hour into this film, and I'm thinking to myself, nothing's really happened. Not a lot has happened. I mean, Mad Max basically, there's a fight at the beginning. Mad Max finds the crazy guy. They go to the community. He gets the truck. He comes back, and then they leave again. I mean, so much of this film is just driving, and I think the Terminator movies would be good to take a look at these films because it makes truck driving interesting, and of course it's post-apocalyptic and all these different things. But I mean, both of the first two Terminator films, the main final conflict is someone driving this big truck towards them, and it's so boring in those films because it moves so slowly. And this is just so exciting. Everything just moves so fast and so quickly. And let's take a moment to just nod the absolutely incredible editing that is this film. I mean, to make a film like this, the fact that that wasn't nominated for an Oscar is honestly, I suppose, exposes what the Oscars really is. And I'm not saying it should be nominated for Best Picture or Best Director, but at the very least, Best Editing, because the editing is absolutely insanely on point. I mean, every single cut just feels purposeful, and even though there's so much of this film that they're probably not driving at near the speeds that they're actually driving, and they're doing all these incredible stunts. And I believe with this film they're only shooting with one camera, although I know with Fury Road they shot with multiple cameras, but I believe that was the first film George Miller did with multiple cameras. And the fact that he was able to get all this different footage from all of these different angles, and so many cool angles too. That's another thing I want to take a moment to nod to George Miller. It's very easy to make this film kind of, basically just get in your car and point out, sit in the trunk and kind of just have a camera and just kind of point and drive to the side or in front of. And yeah, George Miller is willing to take the risk of it, just having these really strange and interesting shots, and obviously endanger his own life, and take a lot of physical risks with this film, and it really pays off. There's a lot of scenes that you can tell are fast forward, like they play it at a higher speed than it was shot, which I'll admit, if anything feels a little wonky, it's that. And it's not like I'm not so much concerned with like fast forwarding the footage of the actual like cars themselves, but whenever there's people in it, you can tell it's not moving at a normal speed because they kind of fidget and move, because people kind of move at weird and interesting paces. And it's one of the few moments that kind of takes me out of the film. And I know it kind of creates a certain feel for the film and a certain sense of anxiety. And I'm not saying not using that is the solution, but perhaps George Miller leans a little too heavily on it, and maybe they use it a little few too many times. But there really is no criticism for the stunts. I mean, the stunts are just absolutely amazing, and I have to ask myself how they did the stunts with the kid, because it honestly feels like, the kid is on that truck. It feels like they're driving and he's grabbing him and doing all these different stunts. It's just, I mean, it's just wonderful. And if for no other reason, I would want to meet George Miller to ask about, doing the stunts for a film like this, because so many of the films I watch are very dialogue heavy. I mean, I think of Ingmar Bergman or like, and well, of course, there is a certain craft to shooting these, and certainly the films I shoot are kind of dialogue heavy and very heavy on people sitting around talking. I think there is a certain craft, and I think honestly, a often ignored craft of doing the work that George Miller does. And I think until Mad Max Fury Road, people didn't really recognize that, and I'm glad that George Miller finally got the notice that he deserves with Mad Max Fury Road, because I think all of his films have been really up to par. I mean, I still haven't seen the third one yet, although I hear each one kind of is a more ridiculous version of the last, and I'm definitely going to take a moment to watch the third one, and I think it will be an absolutely intriguing experience. But I'm absolutely fascinated by how he went about just the amazing, and so much of this film is that. I mean, I would say, it's only an hour and a half film. Probably, I mean, the last 30 minutes is just that final car chase, which is amazing that he can keep tension up for that long. And maybe I wish it was a little bit shorter, but it is just so. I think perhaps my problem with that final scene, or chase, I should say, is there's like 50 cars, and it kind of feels like it feels as if Mad Max is kind of going up against this impossible force, and no matter, and not that he shouldn't go up against possible force, not that it isn't interesting. It's just that whenever a car crashes or wherever someone dies, it doesn't have a lot of impact because there's like 20 more cars there, and so I would say you kind of lose the impact of the individual, right? I think of course, the famous Seven Samurai, and at the beginning of the film, or not the beginning of the film, at the beginning of the final fight scene, which is probably 2 hours into the film, although, again, a nod to another incredible director with action, who spends the last hour of his film in the actual fighting sequence. And what Kurosawa does that is absolutely incredible, and perhaps I wish George Miller could have adapted this in some way, which is at the beginning of the final act, one of the samurais basically puts a tally of all the people they have to kill. And every time they kill someone, they kind of mark it off. And it creates a very real sense of where they are, which I think is one of the failures of this film, is you never know when Mad Max has finally, beaten them. And of course, in the end, he doesn't beat them. And I love that reveal at the end where uh, Max, although his dog is dead, which is sad because, that's literally all Mad Max had, he goes to the tank. Although I guess the kid lives, which is good. He goes to the tank, and instead of oil or gas coming out of the tank, it's sand. I love that, and I love that at no point is that revealed to anyone, and it works perfectly. And the idea that it was kind of all hidden in the buses. Not only is it like a fun gotcha, but it's a gotcha that actually makes sense. So many gotchas in films, and I think one of the greatest perpetrators of this is certainly M. Night Shyamalan, who gotcha for the sake of gotcha, and so often these gotchas not only cannot be predicted in the film, there's no real reason for it, where in this film, yeah, there actually is a lot of reasons to put sand in the truck, because then everyone goes after them, and no one, right, and everyone ignores the kind of, group of 10 or whatever people going north. And I do enjoy that reveal at the end, but there's too many bad guys in the car scene, and it can go as long as it goes, but there's no sense of progress. I guess is my problem. It feels as if it feels sort of stagnant, like it's just the same thing happening over and over and again, and it's cool and it's interesting, and George Miller finds all of these unique and interesting ways to kill and to die and to fight, and there's certainly a sense of tension, but I suppose the best way to put it is it feels sort of hopeless. It feels as if no matter how much Max does, it's an inevitability that he's not going to make it. And I know that, like, in the end he doesn't make it. Well, I mean, he lives, but the truck doesn't make it. But I wish they would have taken perhaps a word or two from Seven Samurai, and kind of acknowledged, when the death of people, so that it gives a sense of kind of beating them, or a sense of where everyone is at any one point. And I suppose that kind of gets into my final problem with the movie, along with it feeling as if nothing happens and it feeling, I would describe it almost as episodic. It feels very much like an episode of television. It feels like Mad Max is actually like a short series or a television series, and this is just an episode in it. And I think it's because it doesn't really feel like much happens, and I think that kind of plays into what my final problem is, which is the story itself. And while yes, there is kind of this like vague story of Mad Max wants gasoline, and he sees this community, and then he gets tied into the community, and he becomes an honorable man, and he grows, and he has to get this truck, and he has to drive away, and blah blah blah. I think George Miller fails at the very thing that makes the film so great, which is that he has all of these amazing and interesting characters. I mean, he has the guy, right, who can't feel his legs, who lives in the community. He has the woman whose hair is up. He has the guy with the flying machine. He has the bad guy who loses his partner. You have the head, Humongous, I think, is the head of that group. You have Mad Max himself. And even though you have all these really intriguing and interesting characters who have these interesting character traits, you never really hear them talk. And you never really see their motives, other than, I guess, Max's motivations. Which is frustrating, because clearly George Miller has thought a lot about these characters and have given them a lot unique character traits. And I can say, oh, here's how this bad guy is different than that bad guy. And George Miller does this with every single bad guy, right? Every bad guy and every good guy has their own kind of unique flavor. And you can see just like how, again, going back to Seven Samurai, Kurosawa wrote basically like a binder for every single villager that said, here's your backstory, here's who you are, even though most of them never even talk. It feels like George Miller did the same thing with this community, with all the good guys and the bad guys. They all seem very unique and have their own motivations, but we never really get to hear anyone talk. The only time anyone talks is to move the plot forward. And I know it's not a talk-heavy film. I'm not saying it should become a talkie where people are just sitting around talking. And so many films, especially modern films, I would say, are ruined because they're so obsessed with kind of explaining everything, which I love that George Miller refuses to explain anything. I mean, he barely explains how they got into this post-apocalyptic world. I mean, he basically just says, well, two sides got into a fight, there's basically some sort of nuclear war or something of the like, and that's it. And you assume it's like United States and Russia, but it could have been any two countries. It's not really clear, and that ambiguity is really the way to go because you don't want it to feel dated at any one time. And there's so much of this film that George Miller just refuses to explain, which I enjoy very much. And he never at any time feels like he needs to hold our hand, which I respect about George Miller as a filmmaker, which is one of my big criticisms of, say, someone like James Cameron, who refuses to respect the viewer. But there's so much story to be told here. There are so many stories to be told here. Again, it feels episodic. It feels, because the world he has created, the world building that he has done is so incredibly unique and interesting and real. You want more from these characters. Honestly, I want more dialogue. I want more story, and it's the reason I wouldn't rate this film higher than I do. And to be honest, it still has a pretty high rating. At a 10, I would give this a 7 out of 10. It's enjoyable film. It's a fun film. I think it would be higher up the rating if the story was there, but because there isn't really much of a story, I know it's not really about the story. It's more of an experiment in filmmaking, but it doesn't feel like a film, if I'm being completely honest. I left this film not feeling like I just watched a movie, but like I watched an episode of television. And for anyone who is, right, go to a movie theater and watch a movie, and then go and watch a piece of television or two pieces of television that are just right of the same length. Now, even though you may spend the same amount of time, say, on two episodes of television as you would on, I don't know, a 2-hour movie, the experience is entirely different. And this feels less like a movie and more like television. I wish there was a way I could phrase why it feels that way, and I think it mostly has to do with the story. In a television, you have so much longer to tell a story. I think of The Mandalorian, for instance. It's very episodic. He kind of goes from one place to another, but there's this bigger overarching story. Uh, in this, it feels like there's some overarching story that's not being told, and it's not really told in the first one. And I don't think it's really told in the third one. It's certainly not told in Mad Max Fury Road. I actually read this interesting review that suggested, well, I think each Mad Max film is actually a retelling of the same story, and each one is just more mythic, and it's less and less actually about Max itself as it is about this world, as about the mythic character of the Road Warrior, as they call him. And I think that's exactly what this is, and I think that's what George Miller is so interested in. He's interested in the myth, he's interested in the world, and he's not really interested in the character or the story. And while I think that is a certainly a noble trait, I think that's where the film fails. And at the end of the day, I finish the film and it just feels like something is missing, which is a bit disappointing because I really enjoyed the experience of the film. So, am I going to go watch the third film? Yeah, of course. Am I going to go watch it today? Probably not. I think I'm going to give some time to kind of sit in it, think about it a little while. I mean, I watched the first Mad Max probably 3 or 4 years ago. Of course, you really don't need to watch one to watch the other. They almost have nothing to do with each other. The only really similarity between the first two is Mel Gibson. I suppose the second and the third perhaps had more to do with each other. Again, haven't seen that one. I mean, looking at Mad Max: The Road Warrior and Mad Max Fury Road, there's literally nothing in common other than I suppose they're both part of a post-apocalyptic world. But it was an enjoyable film, and I'm excited to see where this series goes.